Have a special welcome to the members of the British Georgian Club, whom I understand are here as well. So that's fantastic. We're very pleased, we're honored to have Thomas de Waal with us after so many years. I think, Tom, you spoke for us maybe 15 years ago or something like that.
Right.
And why we've waited this long to have you come again, I honestly don't know. We're all very, very pleased to have you here tonight. Thank you. As many of you know, Thomas has been writing about the Caucasus for a very long time. He read Russian and Greek at Oxford, and then went on to work for the BBC, and then became a newspaper journalist, working in Moscow and for the Moscow Times and the Times of London. And from there he went on to write books, Black Garden about Karabakh, and another with a co-author, which I believe I have here, with Carlotta Gall, called Chechnya. And then this is the second edition of the Caucasus, which is really, I've been reading it because I was lucky to go to another book launch earlier. It's a wonderful book, and it covers both history and contemporary times and all of the various areas and peoples of the Caucasus. And so it's great to have this overall picture pieces together. I think I recommend it highly. So Tom, he gave me a very tiny bio, and even by our standards, I'm not giving a very long introduction. But we like small introductions to allow time for our speaker. So I'm going to turn over to him in a moment. I'll just tell you what we're doing tonight. After we hear Tom, he will be signing books, which we have for sale over here. And then you're all welcome downstairs to a reception. We have to go downstairs because, as you see, this is actually a nursery. And poor Rubig in the back, or there he is, has to put it all back together again for the children for tomorrow morning. So we will vacate, have our wine and snacks downstairs. And after a few minutes upstairs signing books, Tom will follow us down. I'll bring you a wine, it's okay.
Okay.
So I'll say thank you very much again to Tom, and please welcome Thomas de Waal.
Well, thank you very much, Susan and Gagik, for inviting me this evening. First of all, can you hear me? Do I need to shout a bit more, or can you hear me at the back? Is that all right? So after a short introduction, I think that's appropriate, because this book is supposed to be a short introduction. This is what this book is designed to be. I think I'm one of the people in the world who is a bit impatient with big books. I think ideally a book should be no more than 300 pages, unless you're Leo Tolstoy, which I certainly am not. And I think I think there's many virtues in a fairly short and concise book. And the idea was, which I pitched to my publisher way back. This is the second edition of the book. So way back more than 10 years ago now, to Oxford University Press, I said, there isn't a single book which explains the South Caucasus to a general reader. It's a region which is on the map in many ways nowadays. It was on the map because of the Russian-Georgian War of 2008, but also because of oil and gas and many other reasons. It's also, and I think since then, been a growing travel destination. People are now going to Georgia or Armenia to do hiking or walk trails that they certainly weren't 10 or 15 years ago. So it's a region that is part of people's consciousness, but there's no single short book which introduces people to its rather confusing history and its contemporary politics. And I said, what I propose is a book which is relatively short, that someone is getting on an airplane to fly to Tbilisi or Yerevan or Baku, and by the time they get off the plane, they finish the book and they know where they're coming. And he said, great. And we signed the book deal, and I think it's been a success. Well, it's been a success judging that this is now the second edition 10 years on, and people are still reading it. And I'm also I was also very pleased because this kind of imaginary reader who I pitched to my publisher suddenly took on human flesh one day. I was standing at Istanbul airport and someone next to me suddenly took out a copy of the book, and there was that reader. He was flying, I think, to Georgia or somewhere. He was reading the book, and he was the imaginary reader that I had imagined, and suddenly there he was in human form. So that was a rather a nice moment for me. So what I'm going to do briefly in about half an hour is just explain some of the themes of this book. I'm aware that you're a much more sophisticated audience than my general reader who knows nothing. You probably know quite a lot. Certainly the Armenian Institute and the British Georgian Society, between you know an awful lot. So I'll pitch it maybe slightly differently. But there are, I guess, three themes which I've developed as someone who's, since the 90s, has been traveling, first as a journalist, then as a kind of more general writer and analyst, to all of these countries: Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and also to Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, when it was still possible to go to South Ossetia. So all of those places as well. So three themes. One theme is that I think of this as a single region, and this is why I start the presentation with this rather wonderful NASA photograph from space of the region, with this fantastic mountain range, the Caucasus, running from top left to bottom right across the picture. This is a formidable mountain barrier. So the three of the borders of this region are, three of the four borders of this region are physical. They are the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the mountains which divide the South Caucasus from the North Caucasus. It's only in the south and the southwest, and as Armenians, you know this all too well, that the borders have changed, and obviously this is Lake Sevan, and had history been different, we might have been seeing this not as Turkey but as Armenian territories. But this is the non-physical borders, and of course the river Arak Sea is going down, which divides Azerbaijan from Iran, which was only became a border in the beginning of the 19th century. So this is one of my themes: is that we should be looking at this region for all the political and disputes and all the conflicts. It does make sense to think of it as a region. It's very different from Russia and from Iran and from Turkey. These nationalities of the Caucasus have a lot of history and culture and modern history in the Soviet Union, which binds them together. They also have a kind of physical infrastructure in terms of railways and ports and connections, which would bind them together if it wasn't for all these closed borders caused by the conflicts. And one day I would hope that these borders will come down, and that it will find a future as a single region, which is a kind of economic hub and a kind of transit corridor, both between east and west and north and south. So that's my first theme, which I like to explore in this book, the Caucasus as a region. I'm not someone who's, you can buy single histories of Armenia or Azerbaijan or Georgia. This is not one of them. This is a history that deliberately sees all the interconnections between those places. A second theme is that I think when you look in the broader scheme of history, the Russian role, which is obviously enormous in many ways, is rather exaggerated. This is my sort of second and slightly controversial theme, that this region has existed long before the Russians came on the scene. The Russians certainly put their own shape on it in the 19th century and also the 20th century. They destroyed local culture on the one hand. They also dragged the region into Europe on the other hand, and secularized it as well. But I think the Russian role is exaggerated, and I think we're seeing that again now, as these countries have now approaching 30 years of independence. Knowledge of the Russian language is declining. Russia's political influence is declining. There's a younger generation growing up for whom Russia is no longer the metropolis it was for their parents. And these countries are looking east and south and west to the European Union and not just to Russia. But there's a bit of, by inertia, I think a lot of people still talk about this region as Russia's backyard. I think that's a bit lazy. In last year's Armenian revolution, you could read some of the coverage of people clearly who hadn't thought about Armenia at all in the last 10 years, and suddenly they were writing about Armenia and it was referred to as Russia's backyard. Well, if it is Russia's backyard, then there's some rather high mountains and a whole country called Georgia in between, and it really is rather a lazy metaphor as far as I'm concerned. So that's the second kind of thread of the book, is looking at it not just through a Russian prism. And I talk to someone who came to this region via Russia and who's a Russian speaker. And the third theme is about the conflicts in this region, and it's sort of presenting this region, saying, yes, of course, these conflicts are the biggest issue here, but we mustn't essentialize them. I think again, these conflicts don't come down to ancient hatreds between people. They come down to political differences, the way, as it were, the kind of the way things fell out at the end of the Soviet period, pitting one nation against another, and so that's a third theme in this book, is that we shouldn't define this region by conflict. It's a region with many nationalities, most of which haven't been at conflict with one another throughout history, and many of which have never been in conflict with one another. So again, I think we have to get rid of that assumption about the region. So, Gagit, let's have another picture. So, I think just a kind of, again, stating the obvious, that those mountains that we saw are the defining feature. This is actually a picture I took when hiking in the mountains of Georgia. That's actually my wife on that horse there in Tusheti, 2004. And I think, one can't emphasize enough how a highland region creates diversity, creates a sort of world unto itself, which defines this region. And the next, and this is also again gets back to my theme about Russia. This is the Georgian military highway running between the mountains and the rivers, over the mountains through places like the Darial Gorge, these stunningly beautiful places, built only in 1817, and the original road was only wide enough for a very small phalanx of army soldiers to march through. And this, I think, explains again how Russia, it was the only route through the mountains if you don't count going down the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea. This, I think, explains again the Russian role in this region, which was that this was a region that Russia could never dominate by military force alone, simply because you had to move troops along this road to get into the region, into Transcaucasia, as they called it, and therefore you needed to work with the local elites. You needed to work with the Georgians, Armenians, and Azeris in the region to govern those countries. So there was always it was an empire, but it was an empire which was not being ruled solely by military force. There had to be a degree of consent in this region, and I think that then continues even more strongly into the Soviet era. But it does, this Georgian military highway then also explains, I think, the Russian view of this region, which is rather romantic in many ways. Let's look. This is Lermontov, and for many Russians, I think Lermontov and his poems about the mountains and his poems about Jvari, the monastery on the Georgian military highway that we saw, and these romantic poems. It was Russia's south. It was the kind of, I think, for anyone, for an English, when I explain it to an English-speaking audience, it was the kind of the Lake District and the Italian Riviera and India all roll into one, as it were, for Russian writers, and still has this rather mystical place in the Russian imagination, which is also a bit patronizing in a way, that it's seen as a kind of beautiful but backward place in the Russian imagination, but I think fondly by many Russians. And Lermontov, who spent time here as a military officer, is a key part of that. Now, one more. Here we are. Now this, if we were to go back to the satellite, could we just go back? Sorry. Going to get to the satellite picture in a moment. Let me explain where there's the Surami Pass is here, running between the two Caucasus ranges. So I'm pointing to it there. So back to, here we go. So this, for me, is a very important point. Is that there was an East-West division in this region. To the west of the Surami Pass was basically Ottoman dominated until the Russians came to the east. It was the Persian dominated, so Georgia was always, for centuries, was divided into this. Western Georgia was under Ottoman influence, and eastern Georgia, including Tiflis, Tbilisi, was under a Persian influence. And in the middle was this Surami Highlands, which is about 1,000 meters high, runs between the mountain ranges, and it was pretty difficult to cross. And what happened was that the Russians, well, actually, it wasn't so much the Russians, it was actually the Rothschilds and the Nobels who decided that they needed a railway across this pass. And arguably, I would say 1883, the moment that railway opened, was the moment that the region became a kind of single region in the 1880s. It's an interesting story because oil was discovered in Baku in the 1860s and 70s. Then all sorts of people were getting it out of the ground, including, of course, the Nobels were there, the Rothschilds were there, Calouste Gulbenkian was there. And they knew that this oil was very high quality, that it could rival the oil that Rockefeller was getting out of the ground in Pennsylvania, but it was much more inaccessible, such that even in the 1870s, St. Petersburg was actually buying oil from America rather than using the oil from Baku. So two things changed that. One was Nobel's inventing the world's first oil tanker, which sailed up the Caspian Sea from Baku to Astrakhan, and then up the Volga, and suddenly they could get it to the Russian market much better. And secondly was the building of this railway, this tunnel, by the Rothschilds, who were in Baku, and taking the oil to Batumi on the Black Sea coast, which had just in 1878 had just become had been captured by the Russians from the Turks. So there was an export port which could take the oil, and all it was needed was a railway, which the Rothschilds financed. The Nobels, as you probably know, invented dynamite, which was useful to blast the way through the tunnel. And so this was a key moment in which connecting this railway was built, took the oil from Baku to Batumi, and in so doing, kind of made for a single region for the first time. And then later on, if you'll forgive me, this is quite a nice story. The world's first pipeline was laid along this railway again to Batumi, and then the final bit of the story is this young British Jewish businessman from the East End called Samuel, who sends a tanker to Batumi, and the tanker picks up oil and uses the newly opened Suez Canal and takes that oil to Singapore, and suddenly Baku Oil is now capturing the whole of the Asian market via the Suez Canal. And that man, Samuel, goes on to found Shell, and so that's the story of how kind of Baku and Batumi sort of briefly conquered the world at the end of the 19th century. Anyway, so this is a story of Russians, but the Soviet Union is not the Russian Empire. The Soviet Union is very different, and I think again there's this rather lazy assumption that of course the Soviet Union had this kind of deep Russian colouring, but it was more than just a Russian enterprise. It was owned by locals, and many of those locals came from the Caucasus. And here are three of them who you recognise. I think you all know the man in the middle, Mr. Djugashvili. Who can tell me who the other two are? Exactly. So Mikoyan on the left and Orджоникидзе on the right. Fine collection of moustaches. Mikoyan, Orджоникидзе committed suicide in about 1930, something like that. But Mikoyan was the great survivor. He was the one who served from Lenin until Brezhnev. Was the great survivor. But anyway, my point here is just to make a kind of obvious point, which is that even in the 20s and 30s, the Soviet Union was not a kind of purely Russian enterprise in this region. The locals were also in control, and I mean Stalin is obviously a very frightening and complex figure, but it's also a figure of it's also an example of how a Georgian from a backwater of the empire could rise right to the top of this state. So this again, I think we have to view the Soviet Union as a slightly more complex creature than it's sometimes imagined, and certainly that's true for this region. And it's also the Soviet Union also went through very, very different epochs. There were very many different Soviet Unions, and I would argue that after the death of Stalin, there was something. It was actually probably the best place to live in the Soviet Union was probably in the South Caucasus. Let's take another. So this is Rustaveli Avenue in Tbilisi, and this is sort of trying to demonstrate. I think this is the 1960s that the Georgia and Armenia as well, I think, had the highest car ownership in the Soviet Union. This was they did extremely well by the Soviet Union. They had a higher standard of living than Russia. I remember going there as a student in the 1980s to both Georgia and Armenia, being struck by how well dressed people were, how again by the fact there were little traffic jams that you certainly didn't find in Moscow. There was highest private ownership of land also in the Soviet Union. So I think obviously the Soviet Union was a very oppressive country, but in the 60s and 70s there was a kind of a fairly not a bad time to be in Georgia and Armenia, and of course people fondly remember things like, I don't know, the films of Parajanov or the Tigran Petrosyan, winning the World Chess Championship and celebrations on the streets of Yerevan, or Dinamo Tbilisi and Ararat winning the Soviet soccer championship. So this was a relatively good period for that region in some ways, if not in others. And then this is, I rather like this postcard of, this is Pitsunda in Abkhazia. We think of, and this is again trying to kind of get away from how we think of Abkhazia. When people think of Abkhazia, they probably think either of the terrible conflict there, or they think of this rather ancient place by the Black Sea. But also, this is the 1970s, when it was the kind of one of the, along with Crimea, was the Soviet Union's favorite beach resort. And I guess this is also one of my themes, is how there's this very kind of secular imprint left by the Soviet experience on this region, whereby people don't exactly look like that nowadays, but certainly this is not Turkey, this is not Iran, this is a very deeply secularized place as a result of the Soviet experience. But of course, that all changes in the 1980s, and I guess the argument I would make is that there was, and Susan's and my friend Ron Sooney has written about this a lot, about how this phenomenon, about how there was nationalism in the Soviet Union already there in the 1970s and 80s, and then this nationalism produces a character like this one, Zviad Gamsakhodia, a writer, son of the most famous Georgian writer, who rejects the Soviet Union, which is, a perfectly understandable and legitimate position, but rejects it in favor of this very kind of atavistic Georgian nationalism, which rejects other nationalities within Georgia, whether they be Abkhaz or Ossetians or Adjarians, and pushes, within a few years, pushes this rather comfortable and prosperous place that we saw in that slide just a few minutes ago into a state of basically total collapse. Now, of course, he's not solely responsible. There are corresponding figures in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, the Soviet government medals, but certainly I think we were all shocked by how quickly this kind of nationalism, which had been rather kind of low alcohol nationalism in Soviet times, suddenly took on real force in the 1990s. And this was the region I was coming down to as a journalist from Moscow, and really terrible times in the 1990s in the region. And so this is Georgia. This is coffins being flown out of Stepanakert in a helicopter during the Karabakh conflict, which we can talk about more. I'm if you want to talk about that more in questions. And this next slide is the Azerbaijani side of the conflict. This is this terrible image of these weeping women in the town of Agdam, who are mourning and scratching their faces until they bleed. So that would be a whole presentation itself about how these conflicts began suddenly in the relatively peaceful region that had been relatively peaceful for 70 years. But we can certainly say that the 1990s was a kind of replay of what had happened in the early part of the century in this region in sort of 1918 to 1920, and we're still living with the legacy of that period. Just two more slides to finish on. This is a kind of a pipeline picture. I think this is the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. And I think no discussion of this region would be complete without talking about how oil and gas politics have changed this region. I have a chapter on that. You know, for good and ill, I think one can enumerate both the positives and the negatives. The positives, the way that this, I think these pipelines kind of consolidated the independence of Azerbaijan and Georgia, because these pipelines were out of the reach of both Russia and Iran. They were basically under the control of BP, you know, a Western oil company, which isn't the most altruistic force in the world, but which at least had no designs on the independence of those two countries. And also, quite importantly, in the case of Azerbaijan and Georgia, meant that they were no longer reliant also on Russian gas. And the negatives, which in Azerbaijan you see the formation of a petrostate with all the corruption, the kind of single economy, and the way that power is consolidated in the hands of a few, and the proliferation of even greater corruption, and the fact that oil and gas don't actually create many jobs, that they create money, but they don't create many jobs. And of course the fact that Armenia is bypassed, but I think that was probably inevitable soon, because of the Karabakh conflict. But anyway, that's a theme. It's one chapter in my book. It would certainly be a whole presentation myself, but it merits a little discussion. Slide is we're in Yerevan. This is last spring. I love this picture. I think unfortunately I got my timing wrong. I went to Yerevan about a month before everything kicked off. I would love to have been there, but I was already back in London when it kicked off. As I certainly didn't see it coming like anyone else. But these joyous scenes in Yerevan, which I think delighted people who thought that Armenia was never going to change, and for all the kind of negatives that we're seeing at the moment in Armenia, we should I think still enjoy the pictures like these. I think why is this is part of my updated chapter, my kind of last chapter in the book, looking at the region now, and I think sort of trying to sum up a few themes. One is that this is a kind of this is not even a post-Soviet generation, this is a non-Soviet generation. These people, the Soviet Union doesn't mean anything to these people. Most of them probably haven't been to Russia. Maybe they speak some Russian, but just as a foreign language. They're Armenian speaking. Their world is formed, for good or ill, by Armenia and by the kind of maybe the digital international space that they live in. These are people who had no respect for the previous regime and suddenly were not afraid of it and were able to come out and overthrow it, and that they were rejecting violence, as this poster at the front shows. So I think, but also these are people, because this is a non-Soviet generation, these are also people who have much fewer connections certainly with Azerbaijan, but also with Georgia probably, than their parents did. And that's also, I think, creates issues for the future if we are going to get back to this issue that what makes sense for the future of this region is that is all these cross-border connections between the three countries, that they will find prosperity and development much more by being together than being apart. But anyway, I wanted to kind of finish on a more positive note, and I think this is a brilliant picture encapsulating that moment in Yerevan. So I will stop there. As you can see, this is a kind of mad dash through several countries and conflicts and historical epochs but trying to sort of draw out a few themes which I'll be happy to respond to in your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.